Hi, everyone, and welcome. We are so excited to have AP reporter and editor Scott Stroud with us today. He covers Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia. My name is Sarah Weigel. I'm a professor of publishing, and here moderating today is Jennifer Duck, professor of journalism here at Belmont. Thank you so much for being here today. We can't wait to talk about freedom of the press. One thing to note for those that are watching is we do have the chat feature turned off, but the Q&A function is on. So you can go ahead and send questions through the Q&A, and we'll bring those up later throughout the event as fits and as Jennifer moderates for Scott. So with that being said, Scott, we're so happy to have you here and excited to get started.
Thank you. I'm happy to be with you.
Thanks for joining us, Scott. Scott, you and I have done panels together. It's just really good to see you, and I know a lot about your history, but I'm not sure our students know everything about you. So can you just give us a little bit about some of the places you've worked? I know you're at the Associated Press now, an editor of 3 states, which is no small deal, but you also worked at a number of other places. So give us a little background too.
Yeah, so I've moved around quite a bit in my journalism career. That's sort of the nature of the business these days. I started years ago in Arkansas, moved to Kentucky, worked in North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, and then Tennessee. I've done a lot of different jobs. I have worked on projects and been a news columnist, a Metro columnist in San Antonio for a couple of years. I've been a politics editor in a couple of places and just different I've sort of dabbled in just about everything in the newspaper business, which of course has changed over the course of my career a ton.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting thing. We were talking about this in one of my classes. So you're talking to students today from our special topics course with Professor Weigel, the Watergate course. You're talking with mass media and society students. We were talking about newspapers all week. And media ethics as well, some of our students from media ethics, and also another special topics course that is co-taught by myself and Dr. Mary Ellen Pethel, which is democracy, media, and the public sphere. And I know others are joining as well, others from the Belmont student body, but we've all kind of been talking about newspapers, their effect, what's happening in this digital era. You know, a lot of us don't get the physical newspaper anymore. We're drawn to online and the digital world. What have you seen just as the landscape? How has newspapers, how have they changed, you know, since the beginning when you started to now?
Well, the biggest change, of course, is the internet and sort of where people get their news. You know, when I started, the newspaper was really pretty primary. It was the most detailed source of the news, both locally and nationally. There was a limited number of sources. Most people, when I started in Arkansas, there was a state newspaper that, you know, people generally read. And what that meant, I think, was kind of there was, you know, a limited narrative. Like now with the web, there are so many different sources of information that it's a little chaotic, and it's sort of hard from the consumer of news standpoint to decide who's telling the truth, what's real, what's fake news. You know, it's just over time, that long arc, it's gotten a lot harder to sort out. I think it's a little bit baffling now. I think right now we're in a little bit of a wild, wild west period where we're still not sure what our future is. You know, newspapers have moved away from print. I suspect your students don't read a print newspaper very often. Maybe if there's one on the table when they're in an office or something, they might take a look at it. But generally speaking, I don't think that's a source of news. Most of us in journalism have evolved away from that. TV is still a pretty big source of news, but cable news changed that in a big way. There are multiple choices and options for people. And if somebody's watching the Fox News channel, they have a completely different perspective from somebody that's watching CNN or MSNBC or one of the other networks. And then of course the network news has been relegated to, you know, not a 24-hour cycle. It's a little bit of a different role from back then when it was really primary for a lot of people and where they got their information.
Yeah, and I think what's really telling is the World Health Organization, you know, this time we're in, we can't have a event like this and not mention, you know, this time we're in, this pandemic. But they had a whole task force called, well, it's for the infodemic, so the information epidemic. And that really struck me, and it's really shaped my research outside of when I teach and when I teach as well. But this infodemic we're in extends into our media world. We're constantly being flooded with information. We don't know sometimes what to believe, who to believe. But
Right.
I think, you know, there's a point of where we should be hypercritical, not hypercritical. We should have healthy skepticism, but not be hypercritical of certain sources. And I think the Associated Press is absolutely one of those sources we can trust. Take us through just kind of the ethics and kind of what you go through in order to get a story out there. It's not just like you can write anything on Twitter and all of a sudden it's, you know, up and online. There's procedures and ethical standards that the Associated Press and other news organizations, reliable news organizations take. So can you walk us through that, just kind of to understand what journalists do and why you can trust these sources like the Associated Press and others?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a really good setup. Like from the consumer standpoint, it's sort of baffling, as I said, to sort out various news outlets. So what I think that requires is for you, the reader of news, to be a little proactive about where you're finding things out. Who do you trust? How do you know something is real? If you see something on your Twitter feed or Facebook or someplace, could it come from the Russians? Could it come from, you know, what is the source of that? How do I know that's true? And what you get with, you know, AP is a, you know, nearly 200-year-old organization. It goes way back, and it's, you know, has traditions and standards that have evolved over time, but have been really carefully thought through, where we don't pay for information. We don't cite information that somebody told us somebody said. If we do an obit, we have to confirm that with a funeral home or a direct representative of the person who died, so we don't get it wrong, which basically means that you can rely on the information as being sourced, coming from someone who's in a position to know. And if we do something like use an anonymous source, we have standards for that too, and we're going to be careful to make sure that we know that what we are reporting is verifiable, and explain how we know that. So as much as we can, we have this across the board set of standards that for reporting the news that inform our report, and I think give us a lot of credibility with the public. The public knows, you know, on political ads, you see AP cited as much as anybody, just because it's sort of seen as the middle of the road, you know, stolid voice in the conversation. And if we've reported something, that's reliable. We want to be authoritative. We want to say, you know, when somebody's delivering misinformation, and that's gotten a little more complicated just in the last few years, but we're still sticking to a set of standards, and I think that's what you can count on when you read an AP story.
Yeah, so I think that's really important, and you laid it out so well, that we should have some healthy skepticism of what we read. We should know what we're reading. We should understand there are reliable sources like the Associated Press and others, but also that there are people out there who are saying they are journalists when they are not. You know, they are commentators or pundits, and they have bias. They do things that journalists do not do. So I think that's a really important distinction. I know a lot of people are just joining us now, so we wanted to do a poll, and this was something you wanted to ask. So would you like to? I'm gonna actually read the poll, and then you can we can have the students answer this multiple choice question. So Scott wanted to ask, what is your primary source of news for current events? So where do you get your news? What's your primary source? Is it newspapers, TV, social media? Social media includes Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, news websites, or news apps. So we're going to have the students answer this as we come on here. And we have the results. I feel like I'm back in my TV days.
It's amazing. Wow.
The results are in. Okay, so maybe not surprising, but social media takes the cake with 44%. That's where people are getting their news. I want you to break this down. You know, what do you think? And you're seeing this poll here as well. The social media, 44%, TV, 12%, news websites, 25%, news apps, 19%, newspapers, 0. So if you're just coming on, Scott is a newspaper man too. You know, what is this telling you? What is this poll we just conducted with our live studio audience? What is it telling you?
I think for us, that indicates that we've got to know how people are receiving the news. We want you to think proactively about how you know something is true, but we also want you to think critically about the news. We have an app. Shameless plug, the AP News. It's free from the App Store. You can tailor it to your own news interests, and it's reliable, AP standards informed news. We have a website called apnews.com, I think .com.org maybe, that where we post all of our stories on the wire. So we're in this game. We tout our stories on Twitter and Facebook. And we, of course, get cited when we break news by TV. I think this is just the evolution of newspapers. I think the next question, and this goes back to the idea of being proactive about the news, is how do you know that's true? When you read something on Twitter or Facebook, wow, if that's true, that's a blockbuster. In Woodward's, the release on Woodward's book today, the revelation is that President Trump, while he was reassuring the public that there's nothing to worry about, was at the same time telling Woodward that this is serious, it's deadly, it's in the air, and there's a lot to worry about. So the question is, how do you know that's true? Well, in that case, he has a tape of the interview that's verifiable. In this day and age, you can alter tape too, and videotape and so on. So if it's not a source that you trust, or you think there's a way it could be susceptible to manipulation, that becomes another question. I don't want to create a perception that it's an impossible situation and you can never learn the truth. I think you can by being discerning and by thinking about which news organizations have solid standards and are reporting reliable information that you can count on.
Yeah, and you brought us to a perfect segue with Bob Woodward and his News Out Today. His book is coming out and the recording's released if you hadn't read that yet because you haven't picked up. See, you wouldn't get it in the newspaper, though. You'd get it on WashingtonPost.com or one of the other sites, right? But that's still a newspaper. So online, if you're reading the New York Times, Washington Post, you're still reading newspapers. So that's a good distinction to make too. But I think what's interesting, just to kind of segue to Woodward and Bernstein now and Watergate, they are just known to have cracked one of the biggest investigative stories in history. With President Nixon, we all kind of know the background of Watergate, but it was a very long investigation. This didn't happen overnight. And with this infodemic we're in, with this information coming at us, and we want silver bullets right away all the time, what is the state of investigative journalism right now?
I think there's still a lot of great journalism out there. I think in some ways technology has advanced it and made us more capable of doing things that we couldn't do years ago with data, with social media. When I started in journalism, if a company laid people off, my best shot was to find the bar where workers went or stand at the gate and try and get employees from that company. Well, now with social media, I can go on LinkedIn and find people that worked there and reach out to them, and they have the option. They don't have to talk to me, but it's a way for us it's an advanced way for us to find things out. So I think in some ways it's gotten better. I think in other ways it's sort of harder to sort out. So you have to be clear, direct, and authoritative. Sometimes you have to show your work. I don't know if you guys remember a couple of years ago, the story about Roy Moore in Alabama. He was a Senate candidate who was caught. He had taken an undue interest in young women at the shopping mall. It was really kind of weird. And this was an Alabama story that was in the air. Like, a lot of reporters had heard the rumors, but the Washington Post, the paper that did the Watergate story originally, they verified a lot of it. Like, they talked to some of the women who had complained. One woman in particular had at that time talked to friends of hers who said, yeah, she told me about that 20 years ago. And so by verifying it, they were able to tell the story with pretty good authority. Just a great investigative story. Investigative stories take different forms. I think it's harder to get information out of the government these days than it used to be, partly because the credibility of newspapers has been called in, of journalism has been called into question, and the government isn't always inclined to be as responsive as it once was. But you can do it, and there are people that are really good at it and that unearth great stories. Sometimes hiding in plain sight. The AP a few years ago won the Pulitzer for a story on slavery in the seafood business over in Southeast Asia. It's just a brilliant, brilliant story pieced together by pulling on threads of information that were out in the open, by talking to people who knew people, by talking to people who were in the business. And it was an incredible story. And we on the US side found certain brands in the grocery store. We actually sent a guy out here in Nashville to look for these brands to sort of connect the dots for people. So when you buy this brand of seafood, you're actually, in some ways supporting, we didn't say it quite that vividly, but you're supporting an industry that relies on slave labor. So there's a lot of wonderful journalism out there. Sometimes it's hard because the news environment is so chaotic to sort it out. There is a guy now at the Washington Post who I think is one of the best investigative reporters, David Fahrenthold, who has, in 2016, broke multiple stories about the Trump Charity Foundation. And unless you are following closely, you may not remember that his charity foundation is banned from operating in New York because of what Fahrenthold did. He pieced together the operations of that charity, found that the money was not going where it was supposed to be going based on public reports, eyewitness accounts, and he put that all together. It's just a huge, huge story that in the fray of the chaotic news landscape we're in, sometimes gets forgotten about, but that's a big deal. In another era, maybe in the Watergate era, if that was the only story, if that was a story, that story would sustain for a long time because, this is the President of the United States whose charity operation has been stopped in its tracks. So I think there's a lot of good stuff out there. I'm optimistic about the state of journalism. I'm always encouraged to see students coming out of school who want to do this. And I completely encourage that. I don't know what the news business is going to look like 10 years from now, but I know there will be a need for it. And it'll be, the appetite for news will be high, and the need for people to look under the rug and see what's really going on, that's never going to go away. So what form it takes, I don't know, but it's not an unhealthy business. It's just a little bit hard to sort of sort through it, I think.
Yeah, because of all the information again coming at us. Something we talked about in class today in my classes, in 2016, after the election, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, and I say those two intentionally, but there were many others, but both of those, I think are very reliable sources, but some argue, one sways a little right, one sways a little left. So I'm going to say Wall Street Journal, New York Times for that reason too. But they had a spike in subscriptions in digital, in print, both after the 2016 election. And that is when we started hearing this word fake news everywhere, right? Which I don't even like to say because I think it's, it amplifies something that it's such a general term. And I don't think, it's become this slang word. It's a little hard to understand and break down, but that's something that Woodward and Bernstein didn't have to contend with. They didn't have to try to fight back a tweet or other kind of remarks, this easy characters of attacking journalists and others, but they did not, go unscathed. So there were times, when you watch the film or when you talk to Carl or Bob, they talk about how the government did not like them because the press is the watchdog. So can you kind of explain the watchdog role and why journalists, they are this fourth estate, but why doesn't the government like or why do they want to call journalists and journalism like the real news? Why do they want to label it as fake news?
I think it helps if they can discredit, if there's a report like the one on Trump's charities, if he can discredit the source, he maybe dilutes the impact of that report a little bit. And I agree with you that it's changed over time, but it's never not been adversarial. I think that goes way back to, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams both had like legendary fights with the press and basically tried to shut down freedom of the press. So that that's not a new thing, but it's taken a new form maybe. And if they, now it's probably a lot easier to create a level of chaos maybe than it used to be. But Nixon was notoriously paranoid about media. He ran in 1960 against Jack Kennedy, and there was the famous, sort of the legendary thing where Kennedy in the debates was charismatic and Nixon was sweating, and the contrast visually just had a huge impact. And so Nixon never saw the press as his friend. And he had a press secretary, Ron Ziegler, who was legendary for being hated by the media. And I think there's a story, you guys know this better than I do, but in the middle of the Watergate thing, there's the story where Bernstein misunderstood what he was being told by a source, and they had some kind of code on the hang up on the phone. And when they got the story wrong, they had to back up on it. It was sort of the only major mistake they made during the reporting of that story. But the Nixon people seized on it. See, these people are out to get us. They don't know what they're doing. This is dishonest journalism. And of course, they were horrified. That really damaged their credibility, at least briefly. And the Nixon people totally wanted it to. But so that hasn't changed. That is still the same now as it was then. It's just sort of a different landscape of outlets. And, Trump has a direct pipeline to the public through Twitter, and he uses it. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe, people don't want the filter and they want direct information from the president. I think that's the thinking behind that, is you can go directly to your audience and represent what you're doing for them. But it's changed over time, and the adversarial thing has never really stopped. And that's right. Democrats and Republicans. Obama, when he got into office, you'll remember this, Jen, on his very first day in office, he sent out a government-wide memo that said, we want to have the most open administration in history. And he wanted to err on the side of releasing records. It was a beautiful memo. Like, people were passing it around, and I was working at the Tennessean at the time, and people were passing it around saying, this is great news. And but almost immediately they stopped doing that. They had, agency by agency, they were unresponsive, and they didn't share information, and it took years to get a response to a record request. It's hard to be open because you have to take the hits and trust that somebody's going to take an honest, objective look at what you're doing as a government. And and then Obama, of course, went after some reporters who were using anonymous sources, trying to find out who their sources were, which was uncharted waters. People, that had not been done in at least modern history, I don't think. So it was pretty, it was more adversarial in that way, obviously, than he'd set out to make it. So it's both parties see the press as the enemy. They don't always agree with how we frame up the news. They would rather write it themselves, but of course that's not how we operate.
Yeah, and I would say, having covered two presidents and Senator McCain, so I covered Obama and Bush, and then Senator McCain, and I was working for ABC News and CNN for the latter part, but ABC News for the most part. It's interesting because it does not matter what party they are in. The press is the watchdog. I will say the rhetoric in our current time is much different than it ever was when I covered the past presidents, but it's not easy being a watchdog, but there's an important role with checks and balances and having journalists who are true journalists by definition and abiding by these these SPJ, I'll hold up the book, right? The SPJ Code of Ethics, right? That my media ethics class sees me hold up all the time. So there's real truth, and it needs to be, you know, there needs to be that check. And I think people sometimes don't understand that, and they want to trust someone for, you know, at their word or at their tweet on both sides again. And it can get very confusing. And another thing on fake news, you brought up something that was really interesting. There's an article that one of my classes is going to read, Dr. Pethel in my class on democracy, media, and the public sphere. Fake news goes all the way back to Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Oh, yeah. And there's this great article on it. So they're reading that this weekend. But I think you know, obviously our landscape, our media landscape has changed, but the tactics are still kind of the same, right? Just as the tactics of good investigative reporting are actually, on the flip side, this is a good thing, they're still the same. So we still pick up the phone and call people, right? As reporters, we still knock on doors. We still, like you said, hung out and talked to people to get tips and leads. And so as much as things have changed, they're kind of the same. It's just a different world we're living in, right? But you touched on anonymous sources, and I definitely want to get there because that is also something in the headlines right now. This past week, especially, there's an anonymous source, a few anonymous sources who have been talking to journalists about President Trump, the story about veterans, and I'll have the students look that up if they haven't seen that yet, but just generally about anonymous sources. It's rare that they are used, you know, all the time, but there is a place for them. So what is the time to use an anonymous source? When is the correct time?
I think so. Part of the AP standard on anonymous sources is that they have to have a reason that's legitimate. Like, we don't want to be the vehicle for somebody to grind an axe with somebody else or say something nasty that they don't really want their name tied to. But there are legitimate places, you know, a sexual assault is a legitimate place. Somebody that didn't bring an incident on themselves, but if they're willing to share their story, there's a public interest in preventing that from happening again. That's a valid reason. Somebody who might get fired from their job. You know, I'm supervising the census coverage for the AP this year, and we had a story the other day about census workers who say they're being not given proper equipment and so on to go to do the door knocking phase. They're in the door knocking phase of the census. They've been told not to talk to the media at all. So they will get fired if they talk about that. So how do we get that story? That's a place where we sort of need to use it to let them have anonymity. We need to confirm that they're a legitimate source, like the Post did on the Roy Moore story. And we need to verify as much as we can of what they're telling us. Another aspect of the AP's anonymous source story, standard rather, is that we won't run a quote, like we might paraphrase or represent that a person who asked that they not be named said da 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 da, but we don't run a full quote from them, just because we think that's letting them have their say without backing it up. So that census story had, you know, paraphrased them saying, we don't have good equipment, we have problems, you know, we don't feel safe, but we protected their anonymity. And the other thing that we do when we do that is we spell out why. We gave them anonymity because they would lose their jobs for talking about that to us. There are legitimate reasons to do that, like the victim in the Roy Moore case had a reason not to want the onslaught of attention that would come her way if she told her story again. But you still have to verify it. You have to find ways to verify it with real people.
Yeah, and I think that's it's an interesting thing just to touch on, you know, outside of maybe, and this did affect the news industry as well, but it's something that was much bigger than news. It affected entertainment, news, the medical industry, but the Me Too movement. If you think about that, a lot of that was anonymous, and it touches on that as well, where you can bring a topic with anonymity to the surface and the truth can come out. So there is, you know, obviously the Me Too movement is a huge movement and is shedding light on a very huge wrongdoing that is happening in multiple professions. So there is a point for anonymous sources. And getting back to Watergate, anonymous sources, I mean, would there be Watergate? Would there be Woodward and Bernstein without Deep Throat? Can you talk a little bit about Deep Throat's role as the anonymous source during that time?
Yeah, so, and it didn't come out till years later that this was a fairly high-placed person in the FBI who they verified was in a position to know, but it was very cloak and dagger. Woodward would meet him in a garage on the Virginia side of the Potomac River. I think they had some kind of signal with a potted plant on the balcony of an apartment or something like that. But basically he was confirming and nudging in a direction, but he was privy to a lot of documents that they were looking at. The FBI had a sense of the trail, and I think they had just met by chance in an office somewhere. They were both waiting to meet with somebody. It might have been at the White House, I'm not sure, but they had a casual meeting. They had some kind of connection, like maybe they were both from Wisconsin or something like that. But he ended up being instrumental. Like, they had a standard that they wouldn't do any story that was built on anonymous sources without two confirmed sources who were in a position to know. And the famous scene in the garage where the guy says, "Follow the money," it was that kind of guidance, you know. These were things that people in the hierarchy of the Nixon administration could not talk about. Of course, they would lose their job. They would be off the team. But if they were outraged enough about what was happening, then they wanted the information out. So what that was in that case was a way for them to be authoritative without costing somebody their job, you know. And they had to do it so cloak and dagger with the guy from the FBI because he was very high up, and of course they would dispense with him in a minute if the information came out. One thing that I'll say about that, though, like, I think anonymous sources dilutes the power of a story. Like, think about the story this last week on Trump's comments on soldiers and people who have lost their lives or who have served at all, calling them losers and suckers. All of the sourcing on it was anonymous. But if John Kelly tomorrow came forward and said, "Yeah, I was there," and he said that, think about how much more powerful that story would become with the named source there. The Watergate story, the stories that Woodward and Bernstein did, the famous scene in the movie is where he's reelected at the end, you know, near the end of the movie, and you see it on the TV while they're typing up what they did. A lot of their stories that they broke before the election. They were anonymous, and a lot of other media weren't following that pattern. So, you know, that kind of diluted the power a little bit, sort of by necessity in that case. It was still an important story, and their reporting was borne out by events after the election, but it didn't change the public's view about Nixon at that time, certainly not it didn't change their votes. So there is a cost with an anonymous source. The Me Too movement is a great example, not of the cost, but of, sorry, that's my dog losing his mind.
It's okay. That's life, right?
Yeah, right, the virtual life. So the Me Too movement, I think, is one where anonymous sourcing is necessary and important. The Epstein story is another one, the accusations against him, because the people that are victimized by that, it's a good thing that we want them to come forward and we're encouraging them to tell their stories. So I think there's a place for it. I think it's an important part of what we do. I think a lot of people in Washington rely on it too much. And I think we overdo it at times.
Yeah. We're getting some Q&A. We were going to hold Q&A for just a little bit, but do feel free to start typing in some Q&A from the audience. Please remember your civil discourse. Please remember to be kind. You can ask any questions, and we will, of course, moderate, but please do use appropriate language when asking questions. I appreciate that. So, I'm going to just wrap up with one final question that I think a lot of people are concerned about, and you see as you're on the ground. And again, I want to note Q&A is going to be open. I am giving a chance for Q&A, and we will moderate those questions as well. So please start typing in your questions if you have them. But something you see, Scott, as you cover 3 states, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, something that has been around since the beginning of time, since the beginning of our democracy, voter fraud, voter turnout, voter suppression. We are not known in the US for high voter turnout. You know, I kind of, every time I think about it, I'm kind of like, well, what gives? So what are some of the things you hear from, you know, your reporters on the ground, from as you're on the ground reporting, from people, citizens you're talking to? Why is the US so bad at voter turnout? And is suppression, is fraud, what's going on, and what are you seeing in our current landscape on that note?
I think so. I think the turnout question is an interesting one. Just I think a lot of it is the news chaos, like people's difficulty in sorting out what's going on and feeling like it's hard to plug into the public conversation. There's a tendency, I think, to throw up your hands and say, this can't be fixed. I think money in politics has a lot to do with that. People get cynical about how politics works because they feel like even if they do vote, it sort of doesn't matter. Like somebody with a lot of money is going to lean on the politicians and get their way, and that's never going to change. I think the voter fraud question is red hot right now. One thing we're doing at the AP that I think you can't overstate the importance of that. Like we have always had a reputation for free and fair elections. There are questions being raised by both sides, by the president's side and by the Biden side, about whether this will be a free and fair election. You know, did the Russians interfere with the one last time? Is that possible? You know, the technology of voting has changed over time. We have a guy, he's based in Boston, who is our expert on voting technology, and we've actually added, like 3 of my people are involved in a national election security team because we want our coverage of that to be robust. We want to be as sure as we can that this will be a free and fair election. The mail-in ballot stuff sort of surprised me. Like one of our reporters in West Virginia, he's doing national reporting now on this, but he's in the middle of trying to sort out how the post office handles mailed in ballots and whether that's susceptible to fraud. And so, you know, is there a more important issue than that? I'm not sure there is. I think, you know, all of the noisy conversation about politics that we're all hearing doesn't matter if somebody can cheat in the election. And so I think we want the government to be robust in how it makes sure that that can't happen. And then we want to be, as you mentioned earlier, the watchdog to see, okay, is it possible? Are there experts that can tell us how those machines can be penetrated? Where do the machines come from? How do they work? We don't want to write a book report on a machine, but we want to write a compelling story that tells people whether it's possible to cheat in an election, and to reassure voters, hopefully that encourages people to turn out and participate and vote. I do think, like you mentioned, how, you know, subscriptions were way up after the 2016 election. I do think at various levels and in different ways, interest in politics right now is super high. People are fascinated by this whole give and take, the struggle, the chaos too. You know, they may be a little bit baffled by it, or, you know, it's not always easy to sort out, and they certainly don't want to watch 3 hours of news every night. But I think there people are in good faith trying to follow along and figure out how to make our way to a better place in our political discourse.
Yeah. Was there anything you wanted to talk about before I open it up for questions? And again, students and attendees, all of you on this online format, please feel free to type in questions and we will get to as many as we can. But is there anything you wanted to talk about specific to Watergate, or anything that the AP is doing now before I get to these questions? Anything I missed, anything you just want to bring up?
Well, so just on Watergate, like I hope you guys know what a revolution that was in journalism, what Woodward and Bernstein did. In some ways, they just did it through hard work, you know, sort of gumshoe reporting. They were both young, single, working into the evenings. They were knocking on doors. They did it through hard work, but the impact of that on the journalism business. There is a whole generation of journalists my age and older and younger who were inspired by that, just to want to get in that game and to find stuff out and, you know, affect the way our public life happens. And so it was kind of a revolution. Their paths since they did the Watergate stories have been interesting. The Woodward book coming out today is fascinating to me. You know, he after they let, I guess he's still technically at the Post. He's a senior editor there, but he's written a number of books. He sort of does one or two about every presidency, and he kind of changed his technique. His technique is not the same as it was when he was an investigative reporter at the Post, because in his books he takes a little more literary license where he recasts conversations. I think that there's a little bit of a credibility, like in the Trump stuff today, he's got tapes, which is a little bit different from several of his previous books, because in some of those, he's talked to people that were in a conversation and sort of reconstructed it as if that's how it happened. And to do that in the political world of Washington, you kind of have to take people's word for what happened, which I think is a little bit of a leap. I think there are a lot of people out there willing to not tell the truth or to represent something in a different way from how it happened. So I know that he has to have a couple of sources to recreate a conversation, but his technique has evolved over time in a really interesting way. I haven't read Bernstein's books. I know he did one on Hillary, and he's on CNN a lot. He was on CNN today talking about what a blockbuster the Woodward book is. But they both have sort of become, you know, Washington celebrities. And you said early on, it's unclear whether this book will have lasting impact or if it'll just be, you know, washed over in the next news cycle. But at least in the world of Washington, they are high impact, and they're as close to a celebrity as you can have without being elected to office. And so we'll see. You know, we're in a new world on politics, but the impact of that over time on young journalists, it made everybody sort of want to go and do investigative reporting and find stuff out. And there is a thrill of the chase. It is like detective work sometimes. And when you make that discovery, that document or that interview or, you know, something that sort of breaks a story out into the open, it's a wonderful feeling.
Yeah. Carl Bernstein has a book coming out in the spring, another book. So that'll be interesting to see as well and follow those two careers. Something too that might be lost in the headline today that I noticed, because we tend to skim and scroll through very quickly. We don't read as deeply as we used to, just as a society. I'm saying this. A great academic who covers this is Marianne Wolf, if anyone's interested in reading her work. But just how, you know, a quarter of Americans haven't actually sat down and read a book in the past year. I mean, there's just a lot that's going on in our infodemic and this information coming at us, right? But the Woodward audio recordings, he interviewed President Trump and recorded them for the book, like you said, and they're all, I was reading the Washington Post article, they're all in there, and you could click and read it, but it was almost hard to find. I did, at first I started reading one and I clicked on it, and then the next, and that's the beauty of digital, is it's right there and you can see it, but also it tends to get buried even when you know it's there. So it's really interesting, this landscape we're in, to try to sort through, where is this, where can I find this? But I do think you're right, recording the interviews certainly helps to hear it. And anonymous sources, while they do certainly have a purpose, and we need whistleblowers, it is hard when it's kind of a he said, she said, and people aren't coming forward to do that. But Deep Throat was that anonymous source. I think he was 93 when he came out and he said, I'm Mark Felt, I'm Deep Throat. And that was a huge deal. That was what, like early mid 2000s. So, and his daughter would call Bob Woodward. This is fascinating to me. So his daughter, throughout Mark Felt's life, Mark Felt's daughter would call Woodward and say, is my dad Deep Throat? And Woodward would not give up his source.
Even she didn't.
Yeah, and she didn't know. And she had these inklings, like, I think my dad was Deep Throat. Oh my goodness, right? So it's fascinating to think about that. And Woodward talked about that. I think he's talked about it a number of times, but I'm just remembering like a CBS News interview he did about it on, I think it would be the 50th anniversary, and this was 10 years ago, but they really did change the landscape. And the Pentagon Papers was around that time as well.
Right.
We've seen since then the Spotlight team with the abuse scandal, the church abuse scandal. We've seen huge investigations. Me Too, Harvey Weinstein, Ronan Farrow has, so investigative journalism, I think, is alive and well, but Woodward and Bernstein have a lot of credit, and it goes back way before them as well. But that's the one we remember in our TV time, in our media time that we're in right now. So I'm going to take it to the question and answer session. I'm reading through them. I'm sorry. So we're going to go first to Hope, who is using the infodemic. Hope, I know I talk about it a lot in class, this infodemic, but it's really fascinating. So during a time of an infodemic, Scott, do you have any thoughts or tips on how to navigate consuming too much information versus not consuming enough information?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
I think it goes back to that thing about being proactive. I think what you want to do is be a little bit discerning and think about each source of information. I mean, I have a Twitter feed, and sometimes I recognize, somebody as being of a particular ideology or not, or the other side or whatever. And sometimes I don't, and then I just have to think, well, how do I know that's solid? And if I see that it's from a reliable news source, I think you have to make those calls for yourself. Like, who do you trust as a news source? It's possible to get legitimate news from Huffington Post or from BuzzFeed. They break real stories. They also bend the rules sometimes a little bit more than probably the AP does or the New York Times. Anonymous sources might dilute the credibility. Even within a good news organization, like even within the AP, I can think there are journalists who I want to be sure before I run with. There's a filter, they have editors, and it gets measured. But I know reporters, for example, at the New York Times or the Post, that I think, I've known examples where they pushed the limits and maybe cut a corner that I wouldn't cut. So I think you have to make your own decisions about that. There are reliable news organizations. There are some that grind to political acts, but be proactive and think about it critically, to sort it out.
Yeah, and I would speak to the TV part because I think I can kind of jump on this. I'll take the opportunity. But I think the same way, you tend to generalize a lot of networks, but there are pundits, there are commentators, and there are journalists. And there's these blurred lines of media right now. It's really hard to figure out, Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity. Sean Hannity says he is not a journalist. I agree with that. He is not a journalist. He's a pundit, right? And on the other side, you have MSNBC, and you have the commentators and the pundits. It goes both ways. But then you have really reputable journalists both networks that you would trust. So I think also the media is a very big term that's thrown around, and the media can actually be my vinyl that's sitting on the shelf. The
Right.
media can be a movie or a film. The news media, it's hard to generalize this one group, and there's little pockets of reporters in each group. So I do think you're right. It takes some analysis and some critical thinking. But again, I think there's a lot of hypercritical analysis that maybe, when you find a source and that they follow a code of ethics and they'll retract stories. That's what I always tell my students, right? If you guys make a mistake, you'll retract it, correct? I mean, that's
Right.
That's 101. But if there's a source that you're reading and they don't retract false things, I don't know that I would trust them. So there's just, yeah, it's a huge red flag. So we have another question here. Can you talk about how AP relates to other news information outlets as a supplier of news? What is the contractual formal business relationship? So example, the AP to the Tennessean or AP to CNN.com. So we'll see AP articles appear in the Tennessean. How does that work?
So that's a good question. We're a news cooperative funded by our members, which include the Tennessean as a part of Gannett. Gannett is a subscriber. They have a massive AP contract. Most media outlets subscribe to the AP for what we give them in news content, and also we're an exchange. We share information. If they do a good story, we put it on the wire and elevate their work and amplify it some. You know, we're a clearinghouse to some extent for that. One interesting thing, fewer of our members are newspapers or news outlets with websites than there used to be. I think it's less than 20% now that are newspapers in the AP membership. So it's a company with a website. It's if you're at the airport and you see the crawl of news, like on a electronic light board above, that's often the AP news summary delivering the news. You know, TV networks and stations sort of all subscribe. And so one of our growth markets, in fact, now is in Asia. There's a whole lot of companies and websites that that are buying the AP and support us that way. So our funding comes from them. We're dependent on them. It gives us a little bit of independence. We can drop into a market like Nashville and maybe do a story with more bite than somebody that their subscriptions might go up or down if they did something particularly red hot. That's sort of an old dynamic. I don't think that happens as much anymore, partly because the subscriptions have dropped off so much. But we have enough independence where we can do a story with real teeth, even in the markets where we operate. We're the only news organization with reporting staff in all 50 state capitals. And that gives us, you know, a lot of times when a story breaks in Washington, I'm trying to think of an example. Well, the coronavirus and what each state's doing on the lockdown, we can quickly send an email blast to these reporters on what's the State House listserv and say, you know, do you have a mask mandate? Like sort of the checkoff. What are the elements of what you're doing there, of what your state is doing? And then we cobble that together into a hopefully well-written and compelling national story that says more than half the states have a mask mandate or whatever it is. I'm guessing on that part, but it gives us a reach that a lot of other news organizations don't have, built on our cooperative.
Yeah, and that's really important to get into as we see local newsrooms declining to slashing reporters and budgets, and
right.
You know, it's this digital world we're in where newsrooms are having to cut a lot of people because ad revenue and whatnot is not coming in. So the AP has become instrumental in that. The AP also, I want you to mention the fact check, the AP fact check, because that's really important. As something is breaking, you guys can break down the facts, and you have a fact check mechanism.
Yeah, we have a robust team that we created. I think we created that right after maybe right before, it was right around the time of the 2016 election, when the stream of information was so fast, people were kind of baffled by it. We're not the only ones to do that. The Post has done that. There's a really good one at University of Pennsylvania that sort of did their independent fact check. They've probably been doing it for, I don't know, 10 or 20 years. But ours is some of our, you know, we have some of our best reporters who, if a politician makes a statement, will break that down and very quickly deliver a fact check that says this is true, this is not true, this is a little more nuanced than that. And we don't do the Pinocchios. I think is that the Post one that does that?
That's the Washington Post, yeah. Yeah, the Pinocchio test.
A lot of people, it sticks in people's minds, you know, so they remember it. I'm not disdainful of that gimmick, but it is a gimmick. But our guys are really good, and they sort of get to the bottom. We have a whole robust news research staff in New York that we can go to too, that will delve on some of that stuff. And so when you see an AP fact check, you can generally rely on it as solid and as helping to sort out something that's been put out there in the public sphere.
Yeah, and factcheck.org, I think, is the one you were thinking of too at the University of Pennsylvania.
That's the one at Penn, yeah.
Yeah, Kathleen Hall Jameson
runs
that one.
Yeah, she's wonderful.
Yeah, so yeah, it's a really great resource as well. So on that fact check theme, we have a question. Do and / should moderators, so debate moderators, bear the responsibility for fact checking candidates in real time during debates? Or is it a slippery slope? So example, who's being fact checked, on what, by whom?
Oh, that's a great question, and relevant to the debate that's coming up here. You know, I think former Vice President Biden called for like a real-time fact check in the debates. I don't know how serious a call that was, but I would not want to be that person. There's a lot of nuance, a lot of things that you think are obvious and everybody agrees on, maybe aren't obvious. So it's a little more complicated in a debate. I think I'm more of the school of let people take in the debate and form their own impressions. And of course, you're going to have after action commentary and spin and robust discussion about what was said. I think you have plenty of time to get the fact checking. Even myself, if I'm just watching the debate, I don't want to crawl saying, you know, what Biden said is not true or what Trump said is not true. I'll get that after the fact. I want to form my own impression in my own way, but that's just me. I mean, some people may prefer it. I think it's an interesting idea, but I think we can get that after the fact.
Yeah, and that's interesting. That's kind of that infodemic, the crawl, and
right.
and TV news too. I'll say like ESPN. It took a cue from ESPN with all of the graphics,
right.
And I actually read a lot more. I tell my students that it's like my dirty secret. I actually don't watch a lot of news on TV, but I do think there's real value to video. I do read stories online and watch videos online, but you know, I'm going to those reliable sources. I think the AP is definitely top of my list, AP and others. So really interesting and important to see the fact checks, but you're right. It just depends how you want to see it, and maybe take it all in, see the perspectives, and then hash it out, you know, pause and then digest and go for it. Right.
My preference. Others may feel differently for sure.
Yeah. And others may argue there's only so much time in the day, but I would say, you know, part of our civic duty, let's digest,
right.
especially now, right?
Other things to do.
Right. So what training, this is another question, do journalists receive on interpreting scientific data? It's a skill I have as a science major, but it's something I see journalists tend to lean on experts for. Recently, political commentators have been using scientific data more and more, often misrepresenting it. What are your thoughts on this?
Wow. I'm sure that happens. I think we're fast and loose with both science and math. The AP is a little different. So if I have a story, like if somebody sends me a news release from Belmont or Vanderbilt or something that says we've got a scientific breakthrough and here's what it is, then I don't just, you know, hand it to a reporter, hey, type this up, you know, just put it right on the wire. We have a health and science desk in New York that vets those things. And so I would get in trouble if I assigned that story without either checking with the health and science desk myself or having the reporter do it. What they do, you know, they review science journals and authoritative publications. A story especially on like a breakthrough science discovery has a whole lot more credibility with us if it's been published and vetted by academia before it gets to us. There are some, you know, I think the one that's upcoming is going to be about the vaccine. I think there's going to be a lot of reporting on, you know, is this legitimate? Is this fully tested? We have people that are well versed in the science of that, in how the FDA works, how approvals work. And so we're going to lean on them when that happens. I won't just get a release from Vanderbilt that says, hey, we've discovered the COVID vaccine and run it to the wire. I would send it to those guys and say, hey, can you guys take a look at this? The same thing with us, incidentally, it's not the question, but applies to polling. We're very careful with polling. We don't do stories just on a political poll. And if we even reference a poll, we have to have it vetted by our polling guru in DC for methodology, for have they talked to enough people? How do they ask the question? Is this poll gamed in any way? And so it's one of those sort of, we talked about standards earlier. It's one of those AP standards that you don't think about, but we're very careful with something that purports to be authoritative like that. We check it out first.
Yeah. And you touched on something that a lot of people who aren't journalists or studying journalism probably wouldn't know, but in journalism, there are beats. So beat
Right.
reporters, like I covered the White House for ABC News. You've covered
Right.
many different, you can cover the Metro desk. You can cover many different beats. What is a beat, and what are some of the beats of, the AP? You talked about the science beat and the polling, I would say,
Right.
like the desk, but the beat. Talk about beat
Yeah, and it's
reporting.
interesting. The AP has moved more in this direction, and it used to be more of a phenomenon at a local paper, but the education beat had people who specialized in what the school district was doing and school district policy. Sort of, they had some familiarity with larger education policy sort of trends. You know, if you were taking up an issue, or if the legislature was taking up a school choice issue, you'd go to your education people. So we have a dedicated education team. We have a beat for immigration. I think there are 3 or 4 people on that. We have one for criminal justice, which with police violence and some of the demonstrations and some of these cases going on now, people can give us a very quick sense of the national landscape on those kinds of things. So the Washington beat is, of course, is specialized that you did. Whether, like, if Trump says something that you haven't heard, you're at a news conference and you haven't heard that. Has he said that before? I might go to you on the White House beat and say, has he said that? And of course, if you would know, you would be familiar with it, sort of his record previously, and be able to tell me quickly, no, that's not new. He said that a couple months ago, and it's just a throwaway line for him. And so it's not going to be news. So I'm trying to think. Environmental, we have a dedicated environmental team that comes out every once in a while. They did a thing a couple weeks ago that had multiple states talking about how the regulation of the environment had basically been scaled back. Such a hard story to report. You're dealing with the EPA at the center, and then each state's administration of regulations on water, on air, and you know how complicated and esoteric that can be. We have in our states the coal industry regulations, another very specialized field. And so, you want a little bit of expertise. Journalists by nature are kind of generalists. We think we can plunge on something quickly and understand it. But one of the key things for us to understand is what we don't know. And if we're delving into a field, the last thing we want to be is cocky about, oh, I see, or let somebody just lead us to water and we drink whatever they're selling. We want to be skeptical, and we want to have our own experts that sort of help us sort through that.
Yeah. And I think something interesting, just to bring it back to Watergate too, Bob Woodward was on the Metro desk, like the Metro beat,
right,
when he started with Watergate, and he was a cub reporter, meaning brand new. And it's like a assignment to go cover this court case that no one thought was anything. And he heard the judge say, "What branch are you with?" And the guy said, he whispered, "CIA." And it was like this moment where it was this bombshell, right? Like, wait, his ears perked up and he was like, CIA, what is this? And that was where it all started. That's where the story began. And not many other reporters were in the room for that. That's how Bob Woodward started and got the tip and started digging. So sometimes it's on these beats. And I would say local news is more important than ever for our local, just our livelihoods, right? But local reporting is something that's suffering not only in the pandemic, but before that with ad rates and everything going digital. But local reporters can uncover big, news events as well in these beats, and some of these beats are being kind of taken away. So the AP can also fill some of this, but also this is kind of a landscape problem we're seeing in the digital era, along with a lot of other things. So it's really interesting. But yeah, the beat reporting is helpful for the scientific. There's a whole website that I'm fascinated with that came out right before COVID called STAT. I don't know if you've heard of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's like a whole scientific journalism, but it's run by scientists, and it's an interesting thing to think about, because there are actually whole outlets that will just focus on that. And that's not a new thing, but they're really,
yeah, I think they are
affiliated. Yeah. So the Boston Globe. Yep. So they do have that relationship, but it's interesting because they branched out and made their own publication, basically, just based on, and this was before COVID. So what good timing in terms of when they started doing it, because this was something that had been in the works for quite a while. Yeah,
Well,
but I
and
think
healthcare is
that's
another area, another beat area that's sort of specialized and complicated, and we need people that understand that, what are all the implications of Obamacare and so on. Some of that falls to state house reporters just because there's legislation involved. They have to be generalists, but they specialize in how a law goes forward. And so, yeah, it can be complicated. So you want people that know how it works.
Yeah. And healthcare is one of those topics that might not be sexy, but man, is it important, right? And it affects all of us, and
Right.
students, you're covered till you're 26, but if that law changes, that'll change. So it's, if you're on your parents' insurance, that is. So it's really interesting because to follow that one, it's hard. The economy is another thing where I had to cover the economy for a while, and it's the Treasury Department, and it was, a beat it's again, some people would say like that the White House is so much sexier, but Treasury taught me a lot. The Justice Department, when I covered that, taught me a lot. So yeah, these beats are really important, and to dive in and study them every day is an important task as well.
And the best thing we can do with that is translate, right? Like put it in plain English and make it accessible to people. We take the gobbledygook from the school district or the business or the economist or whatever and say, here's what that means. Here's how that impacts you. So,
yeah, 100%. So we have another question here on anonymous sources. It almost seems like the risks outweigh the rewards when it comes to the use of anonymous sources. What is the process like for deciding to use or not use them? And do you think that the use of anonymous sources takes away from the credibility of the source for most readers?
yeah, I think it casts doubt. Like I'm going to take your word for it that somebody told you this. I think it does diminish the credibility. Sometimes it's important enough to include. What you want to do, though, is find actual reportable information around the anonymous source, so you're not just doing an anonymous source story. Our process is really rigorous. Like, I can't approve that myself. I need to go to my boss in Atlanta and say, hey, I think this is a place where we want to use an anonymous source. Here's how we know that's true. With that census story I did, we verified that the person worked at the Census Bureau. We saw documents that verified that. So it's not quite just take our word for it. We'd rather they be named. The story would absolutely have more credibility if it was, I, Mary Smith, a door knocker for the Census Bureau, was told I had to go out there with no mask, no hand sanitizer, no nothing. But she would lose her job. And so we had to find another way to get that story, which if we just reported an anonymous story saying this, that would be one thing. But we talked to others about what they knew about it and verified. You go as far as you can to confirm elements of the story, and that every bit of that sort of builds credibility. It's a great question. I think Washington is guilty a little bit of anonymous source abuse. Stories leak out into the sphere that aren't verified, and somebody sort of, dismisses them and writes them off. And maybe you could have gone a little further and got people to put their names to that, and it would have more authority. I think Woodward's current book is going to have authority because he's got tapes of the president saying what he said. He's not recreating conversations like he has in prior books based on 2 or 3 people who aren't named. It's right there and you can listen to it.
Yeah. And I do think, going back to Watergate again with Deep Throat, he continued to work in government for decades, and he did not lose his job, because he was anonymous. And there's, at the end of the day, we're all people. We have to have a livelihood. And I think that's why sometimes people do remain anonymous, but it really muddles the water. There's a call right now. I think Brian Stelter is one of them who I was reading about, who said these anonymous sources on the Trump veterans story need to come forward because people aren't going to believe it until they come forward. But you have to think about the other side of that is they're probably not coming forward because they might still be working in the administration, or, so there are a number of ways to look at that, which is interesting. And we don't know, I don't know who the anonymous sources are. The AP has reported on some of this as well. It started with the Atlantic, Fox News, the AP. So everyone is using anonymous sources. It's not just, you know,
Right.
one outlet. But this is a case where I think, you know, there were enough checks, I assume from the ethics and standards standpoint, that this was able to run. And it's interesting to see the media landscape of the anonymous source in that story, because it did hit so many different outlets, including, you know, Fox News, which some people would say, you know, if it's not reported on Fox, like, I don't know, but it's been fascinating to see it play out and see where it's landing with the anonymous source.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. No, that's good.
So then we have a question here about the media landscape. I love this one because it has to do with podcasts. And you know, Scott, I love a good podcast. How do you feel about candidates like Biden and Buttigieg branching out into forms of traditionally owned media, like their own podcasts, in addition to participating in traditional news media? What impact do you think this will have going forward?
You know, I think, I'm not sure. It might have an impact. I think it's sort of parallel to Trump going to Twitter. I mean, his is the first Twitter presidency where he communicates directly to people through tweets. A podcast is sort of much the same way, but with a little more depth, most likely. I think that's probably going to hit a limited audience. Most people don't have time to sit and listen to Pete Buttigieg for an hour. They might have a particular interest in his candidacy. So I think it's a little bit of a boutique thing, like it has limited value in that way. But it goes back to that question of where you get your news. You know, I think you can get a lot of great information from a podcast. WPLN here in town, the public radio station, has done some great investigative work where they've dug deep on a housing project or police violence over the years, and it's really robust, substantial work. And you know, just having that in the public sphere has an impact, because the government officials that it's about know that it's out there, and those of us in the media can read it and watch it and learn from it. So I think there's a place for it, but it's, you know, it is very specialized. Maybe has a limited audience.
Yeah.
But I don't know, you know, I don't know where we're headed either. You know, like the future of media is somewhere where we can't name it right now, I don't think.
Right. And it's interesting to look at, you know, a lot of the national outlets, their podcasts, like The Daily from the New York Times has, I think it was 1.5 billion downloads. I mean, it's crazy. Like they're getting as much as, and that was last December. So that was the last time I was reading about it. But, you know, they're obviously probably tenfold now. They have, the New York Times has capitalized on the podcast market. We have obviously Spotify. So they mentioned that the student just mentioned the Obamas. Michelle Obama has a podcast on Spotify. I wonder if we'll see other, you know, if we'll see a Trump podcast or if we'll see a Biden podcast. It'll be interesting to see where they go with this, or if Twitter is the media of choice because it's easy. You get it all out in how many characters, right? So
I mean, you're deeper on a podcast, that's for sure. You know, you can put you know, a more substantial message out there than you can in 230 characters or whatever it is.
Right.
I mean, I think that has value and certainly can help shape the narrative of others who have a role in shaping the narrative.
Yeah. I always say podcasts are like documentaries for your ears. I just love them. My little 2 cents. I have a bias towards podcasts. I love them. So we have one last question here and we're going to wrap it up. And I feel bad I can't offer you water over Zoom because I feel like we've kept you so long and we appreciate your time. This last one, this is an interesting question too. Can you comment on QAnon and how it's swept through social media? And this person says, this is Kitty, it's hard to understand how people believe QAnon. So this is a question from someone watching on QAnon. And I think a good question too, a good follow-up for this is, how do you report on it without amplifying it in terms of conspiracy theories?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially that last part too, because some of these organizations thrive on oxygen and attention. You know, the Klan sort of disappeared from the landscape, at least in appearance, for a long time, because nobody ever reported on him. David Duke, he just was not named in most major media, and they've kind of resurfaced. Some of that, may have to do with Trump not dismissing them quickly enough. He's been more receptive, or said the famous thing after Charlottesville about fine people on both sides. He's been slow to criticize some of the counter demonstrators in some of these cities where protests have emerged. So I think that it's not exact, I don't know, is that a wink? I think that's maybe not shutting it down as quickly. There's always been extreme views on both sides that have been out there. They feel like they're closer to the center of the discussion than they have been in a long time. And I think it's interesting at the AP. So after Charlottesville caught us by surprise. We knew about the demonstration, but we had kind of been in the habit of ignoring them for that very reason. You don't want to give oxygen to people who are chanting "Jews will not replace us" and that kind of thing, because that's what they want. But after that happened, there was a demonstration, I think it was in Murfreesboro. And so we staffed it because we wanted to make sure that there wasn't going to be another Charlottesville, but we didn't write a word about it. It was uneventful. There wasn't much that happened. There were some people yelling back and forth across the street. But we made a judgment call that we didn't want to be any part of encouraging groups that were encouraging violence. This was a pretty I forget the name of the group. It was a pretty out there group. This was a couple years ago. But we put somebody to work on a Saturday to go staff it and to monitor what they were doing and make sure that it didn't, end in tragedy. And so that's a difficult thing for us. But I do think we want to be discerning in covering that. When the president mentions one or retweets with favor somebody that's endorsing something that's an out there point of view, that kind of makes it news. He was supportive of the candidate who had espoused QAnon views and who actually won her primary and is now probably going to be in Congress from Georgia. And I think she was at his convention speech. And so that's crossing a threshold that we sort of have to deal with and have to treat seriously as a part of the public debate. But the last thing we want to do is to, without grounding and without context, just say this is their view and, encourage copycats or create an atmosphere where people might latch onto that kind of thing and it's actually dangerous.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Kitty, I would turn you, because I like podcasts, I would turn you to the podcast. It's called Rabbit Hole, and it is a New York Times podcast. So, but it's really interesting. It delves into that world and how things are amplified. It talks a lot about YouTube, but they get into a little bit of that. But it's hard as a journalist. I think you're absolutely right. You don't want to not cover things, but also the white supremacy is a good example that you used, where David Duke flew under the radar, and then when things are brought to the surface, sometimes it's a lot to try to handle how to report it, and I think that's something that the media wrestles with as well. As an academic, studying these things, it's very interesting. That is one thing that I've been looking into. So it's, you can take that longer view approach when you dive into tweets and things of that nature. But it's a slippery slope. I think it definitely can be.
And
we actually,
we were talking about beats earlier. We actually have a guy who specializes in sort of understanding all of those underworld movements, and so if something like that surfaces here, I'll usually just reach out to him and say, hey, what do you know about these guys? And it does occasionally surface, and he'll give me a good perspective on how they fit into the landscape, and it's just one guy in his basement or something like that.
Yeah. How big is it, and how much should we be covering? Yeah, that's a very good point too. Well, Scott, is there anything else you'd like to add in our final few minutes here? We've covered so much ground.
I just really appreciate the opportunity. I like what we do and still think there's a place for what we do. I know we're headed to new territory in what journalism is becoming, but I do still think it's important, and I hope you guys stay engaged with the news and follow along. I think it's an important part of how we do as a society. But I really appreciate the opportunity. I enjoyed the class.
Well, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Sarah, Professor Weigel, any final words?
Yeah, thank you so much, Scott. Just love that you could come and speak to so many people, not just the Watergate scholars with me in my course, but I know Professor Dux and Pethels, some of their students, and then the wider audience that tuned in just from the community. So we really appreciate you. For all the students out there that are looking to get WellCore credit, we'll have a slide on when we wrap up in just a minute. There it comes. Just reminding you that you'll need to log on to Blackboard again later once the quiz goes live. Couple question quiz so that you can get that credit if you're looking for it. And I think that's probably it. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott. We really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Enjoyed it.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.